Let's now do the reading from Living Wisely, Living Well. This is a rather short one this week. When others are speaking idly, don't be drawn into that light chatter. Be respectful, but remain somewhat apart, perhaps even silent. Idle chatter, like radio static, disturbs the perception of underlying realities. Very true, very true. I think it's one of the reasons I like these readings so much is because Swamiji, he takes philosophy, it is very deep philosophy and very deep instruction, but what he does is he applies it to everyday circumstances that I think all of us can relate to. Think about idle chatter, for instance, is what he's saying here, is to refrain from getting too involved in idle chatter. It's a hard thing to do because almost every situation you come into, a social situation, meeting friends, interchange in life, there's going to be always a certain amount of chatter going on. And it's somewhat idle, you might say, and idle in this sense meaning useless, not with any particular purpose. You might say it's just one of those things in life that we could classify as fillers. I've noticed that oftentimes if you come into a situation, or there's a group of people there, and all of a sudden it becomes silent. You know, those moments sometimes that happen in a group sitting aside, and that often makes people actually uncomfortable to have silence. Now, not everybody. Some people quite enjoy that, but lots of times there's a certain tension. I have to fill it up with something. You know, particularly perhaps you're having a conversation with another person and it's all of a sudden quiet. There's this impulse to just start chattering. And even that word chattering has a certain, doesn't it raise an image in your mind when you hear that word chatter? It's somewhat like ducks quacking, quack, 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 or twittering of birds that is just like froth being stirred up on the surface of some body of water, that it's like that surface restlessness. But if you think of even a surface being restless in the waves on the surface, chatter is very small waves. But a lot of small waves, always keeping the mind very restless. And chattering like that restlessness of the mind, in a sense, the outward expression of chattering often is but a reflection of what's happening inside. The mind is restless. The mind is not calm. So what happens is, when we start to find ourselves in situations and where we have developed a habit of this, of a sort of that uncomfortableness, of that quietness that comes, and the mind is chattering, we then begin to express it outwardly, and as we express it outwardly in that chattering habit, pretty soon the mind becomes habituated to that, and we find that we really don't like it to be still. Now, I shouldn't say don't like it on the deepest level, because the soul likes that stillness. That's our nature. But yet the mind, the outward self, the ego mind and the habits that it's formed, it likes to, it doesn't appreciate that, and it wants to be on the surface. And it can form quite a very serious habit. It reminded me, I have a daughter, she's well grown up now, but when she was about 11, 12, 13, she used to like to have she had a big group of friends, girlfriends, and they would all come over to the house. And when they came over to the house, I went to another part of the house. Because they were always exuberant. It was like I used to tease them. That's why I said ducks. I used to tease them, quack, 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 quack. I'd go in there because they were chattering so much. But it reflected that, you might say, that youthful energy that young kids they're getting a little older at that time. They liked that. They liked that restlessness. But when we get older, and especially when we begin to take up the spiritual path, we realize this is one of the obstacles that we face, is learning to be able to calm that froth. There's that saying in the Bible, "Be still and know that I am God." And it's hard. It's really, really hard to be still, because we've formed this habit. And I mentioned the word of chattering is kind of like fillers in our life. And it's not only chattering, but many verbally, but in many ways we find that on one hand, we crave things to be, if it was, I'm so tense, I wish it was nice and peaceful. But as soon as we have a peaceful moment, we find that the mind or our nature tends to want to go out and fill it up with something. And so people begin to fill their life with idle things. If it's not verbal, we find occupations, we find things to do. We run away, you might say, from that quiet, peaceful state, and we fill it up with all sorts of things that are somewhat useless activities and watching television. In the modern age, I guess you'd say playing on video games, and if you ride on the metro, you see everybody just right there, doing something like that, or if it happens to be silence, what you find many people can't stand silence. They have to put headphones on, they have to be listening to music, they have to be having something going on because they've lost the ability to appreciate stillness. And chattering is a good example of that disturbs that and accentuates that bad habit. Now, what happens when we get that habit, that restlessness of mind, that those little waves that are always in movement? What happens is we can never totally be at rest. And eventually, of course, that degrades the body physically, it degrades the body mentally, and we are never totally at peace with ourselves. There's always that restlessness underneath the surface. And we find ultimately, too, that besides our physical health, our mental health, peacefulness of being, it cannot be attained when we have that habit. We have to step aside from that. But also, I think what happens is that we begin to lose power when we chatter, that we have that development of lightness of being. Now, lightness, I don't mean lightness in this case, is there's no depth or no weight to what we have to say. If a person chatters continually, whenever they have that opportunity, that mental habit, that verbal habit, you find that when they do have something important to say, it does not have as much power. Whereas a person who perhaps speaks less, when they do say something, people tend to pay attention. And it begins because it has a certain power to it. There's consideration to it. Chattering is somewhat, especially when you use the word idle chattering, there's a certain mindlessness to it. It's not really conscious behavior. And what we, as yogis, we want to be conscious of what it is we're doing. We want to put presence into it. We want to be there. Awareness needs to accompany our words. Awareness should accompany our actions. And when we act in a state of awareness, there's a power that comes from that as well. Paramahansa Yogananda used to say, he says, he said this to Swami Kriyananda, live always in the self, in the large S, self. He says, come down as necessary from time to eat and to speak with others, but when it's not necessary, return to the self and live in that self. Meaning, live in that state of inner centeredness that is implied in that. Whereas this outward restlessness, we can never find ourselves ultimately to be at peace in that way. As I said, we have to look at different aspects of our life. What is it? You might say do a mental inventory of what we do with our life during day to day and see where is our energy going? Are we somewhat wasting it, where we're not effectively being present in the moment? And you could say all of these whenever we're doing things habitually, unconsciously. It's a form of chattering. The opposite, of course, is learning to be conscious in order to be present in the moment and to do things in a purposeful way. In all the years that I knew Swami Kriyananda, when I read this, I was thinking, I can't remember very often when he chattered. It wasn't something when he would come into a room and there's And this doesn't mean that we don't carry on conversation. He would come into a room and there'd be people and he would carry on meaningful conversation. And if the conversation ceased, he would do something else, talk to this person, that person. He was always very appropriate. But if there was not the necessity to do something outward like that, he would just be very, very much withdrawn in the self. And I imagine that Paramahansa Yogananda was much the same way. He was very present right there. It wasn't wasted energy. It wasn't wasted power. Now, to take the other side of this argument, to balance this, Swami says something here in this reading. He used a word here that I'd like to just remind you of. He said, it had this to do with be respectful. He says, don't be drawn into light chatter. Be respectful, but remain somewhat apart, even silent. Now, this being respectful is, I think, important because often I've found myself, which I'm somewhat, I have to confess, there have been times when I've been in rooms of people where much of this somewhat idle noise is being made. I've sort of looked upon it with a little bit of disdain at times. And that's not healthy either. And so I've said, I'm going to be silent and above it all. And that is not the right approach either. You might even say that's worse, because I'm reacting to something there, and that's very much a reinforcement of one's own ego and one's separation from other people. So if you notice it going on, he says here, you don't have to go there. You don't have to go there, but at the same time, be respectful, because you don't know. None of us know what is going on in the world of the other person. I know sometimes you're in situations where it's important for you to engage small talk with other people. It's sort of, you might say, breaks the ice. It includes other people. I know there are situations where a new person comes into the room and nobody knows that person, and so you go and you chat with this person. Now, the difference between chatting and chattering, think of that. We need to sometimes, it's appropriate to chat with other people, to engage with other people in a meaningful way, but chatting purposefully means being conscious of what we're doing, being present, being in the self while engaged in outward activity. Whereas chattering, on the other hand, is habitual, being, you might say, coming from an impulse of inner mental restlessness. And so consequently, notice that difference. And so there are times when we need to chat with people, go out and say the appropriate thing, and be present with other people. But it's the habituality of not really being in control and expressing ourselves through the restless mind that I'm referring to here when we speak about chattering. But also look at the other aspects. We started now, and I made reference, we're starting with the verbal filler. What are those fillers that we have in our life? And you just might want to just go through your life, and what are you filling your time up with? You might say, just as the chattering person often does that because they're, you might say, afraid of the stillness, afraid of the silence, afraid of the self-awareness, that self-consciousness that comes when silence does come, and they have to fill it up. Well, that's just one form of this, and this mental chattering takes many other forms. And I've mentioned, of course, here again, the impulse to chat with e-chat, you might say that sort of chattering is going on now more and more. Instead of verbally, now we're at a remove from each other, and we continue to do that chattering. I read a interesting study a while back they did a psychological study where they invited a group of college students, I believe it was, and they invited them, and they paid them a small sum of money to come in and take a survey. Psychological survey. And so being students, they all wanted to make a little money. It would be easy. Said all they had to do was fill out a questionnaire. And so they showed up and they were given the questionnaire, and they were put some blood pressure monitors and different medical things were put on them, and they were said they were going to monitor the reactions and so forth. And they went and were escorted into the laboratory where they were to fill out the questionnaire and some questions that were directed to them. Well, on the outside, this seemed to be what the test was about, but there was something else going on, which was the real test. As they entered into the laboratory, the researcher said, "Oh, and by the way, I need you to leave your mobile phone here outside and not take it into the laboratory with you. And this is going to take about an hour, this test. Leave it outside here." And because it could interfere with some of the sensitive instruments we have in here. So they had to leave it out. Now, they also had a control group who they did not ask their mobile phones to be given up. And they found that the people that were asked to give up their mobile phones and they were separated from them for an hour, their blood pressure was of a significantly measurable height above those who had their phones with them. Anxiety came in other words, because they didn't have that ability to chat, or in this case, engage with messages coming in, or whatever it is that attachment to the mobile was there. Well, this is, I thought, a rather humorous example of the necessity we form these habits that become necessities for us to fill our time. And so consequently, we have your mobile phone, the chattering with other people, television. We find people are, you could say, any sort of habitual activity over which we're not really totally in control of. It's controlling us. We find that this too could be considered idle chatter in the sense that it's somewhat useless. It's not having a purposeful thing. Now, some people, I used to joke with people about television. And I says, "Why are you watching that television?" I said, "Oh, but the programs I watch are all very educational." And as if that's why they were watching the television. It wasn't because they were educational. That was a side, you might say, it may be some side small benefit, but really the motivation was they could not keep still with the mind. They could not go into a deeper, restful state. And for those of us, and I think I'm speaking to people here who probably meditate, is we have if we're meditating, there's probably an impulse to dive deeper below the surface of what we see in this world, to find a deeper sense of reality, to find a deeper sense of joy, perhaps to even aspire to have godly experiences in our life. But this will not come about. God's grace is always there, yes, but we have to cooperate with that grace, and that will not come about unless we condition ourselves to cooperate internally and externally with those conditions that allow that grace to flow within us. And so the first thing necessary, particularly if you're taking up the path of meditation, is learn to calm the mind through your practices, but also all the other hours of the day. Try to eliminate some of those, you might say, fillers, and calm the chattering mind, and you'll find that you'll be able to go deeper and deeper into your meditation, and you'll find that you become and gain control of your life rather than your life controlling yourselves. So Swami says, but be respectful what other people are doing. There's no need to compare yourself to others, but it's for your benefit. Go deeper into that, and you'll find that the mind will begin to become calmer and calmer, and you'll find less impulse to find your satisfaction, to find your enjoyment from things outside yourself, and you'll be able to rest and remain in the self, just as Swami was advised by Paramahansa Yogananda. Live in the self. Go out from that self from time to time as necessary to eat and engage in worldly affairs. But then when it's not necessary, return in the self and remain in that conscious inner state of enjoyment, self-enjoyment, you might say, with the big S, and in that calm, centered place within yourself. And don't let the outer world control your lives. And you can begin this through your meditation, but also through all of the daily practices, all those other 23, 24 hours of the day. Try to arrange that environment and be in control of that environment. And you'll find that your meditation practice will improve. And also your outer environment, you'll find that that sense of need for outer engagement and what are somewhat non-essential things in life, you find that that need goes down. And as that goes down, it becomes more at rest. You find that you begin to see joy and experience joy in everything that you do. Many blessings to you, and thank you for joining us this week on Living Wisely, Living Well.